In the stillness of an early morning in ancient Japan, when the fog lingered over temple roofs and the distant mountains dissolved into a pale blue haze, the figure of a samurai preparing for death looked as natural as a stone lantern or a cedar tree bending under its own age. In his world, the ending of a life never stood as defeat, for death itself was woven into the fabric of service, a final gesture that sealed a lifetime of loyalty. Seppuku, born in an era when a warrior's honor outweighed the fragile weight of flesh, was not seen as suicide, but as a ceremonial passage, an act through which a man reclaimed purity when his name had been touched by shame. In that moment, he did not flee fate. He faced it with the same silence and composure he once brought to the battlefield. His movements unfolded slowly, as if guided by invisible rules carved centuries earlier, each gesture echoing countless warriors who had knelt in the same posture before him. The fear that visited ordinary people at the thought of pain and oblivion seemed absent from his eyes. Instead, there was an unusual stillness, as though he had already accepted every suffering that the blade would bring. It was believed that the body served merely as a temporary vessel, something a warrior might relinquish if it allowed the spirit to remain unbroken. And this belief gave seppuku its strange, majestic solemnity. The room around him thickened with the anticipation of the ritual, its silence turning almost physical, as if even the air itself understood that this moment belonged to the ancient order of things. Here, death was not a collapse, but a conscious offering, a return to the cosmic balance that governed all existence. The samurai's gaze remained steady, fixed on a point beyond life, embracing both pain and finality with a calm that bordered on the otherworldly. In that fixed stare lived the philosophy of his path. A warrior might lose battles, land, or favor, but he could not lose honor, for without it he ceased to exist. And if the only way to restore that honor was through the destruction of his own body, then such destruction became not degradation, but ascension. Yet the true weight of the moment revealed itself only when his hand hovered over the lacquered handle of the short blade, and a faint tremor flickered in the candlelight. In that pause, long, silent, breathing with centuries of tradition, a question seemed to rise from the very floor beneath him. What injustice, what burden, what irreversible step has brought him to this edge? The answer, still veiled in shadow, waited to reveal itself in the next part of the tale, where the meaning of the belly, the sacred center of the soul, would unfold its deeper truth. Across the long arc of Japanese history, where myth blended with custom and custom hardened into absolute law, the human body was understood differently than in the West, and nowhere was that difference more profound than in the belief that the true seat of emotion, courage, and conscience dwelt not in the heart, but in the hara, the belly. It was here, beneath the ribs, behind the quiet strength of muscle and sinew, that the samurai believed his true self resided, the unmasked core from which resolve, sincerity, and spiritual clarity emerged. Thus, the act of opening the abdomen was never a mutilation, it was a revelation, a moment when a man bared not his weakness, but the naked truth of his inner being to heaven and to all who stood witness. In the dim light of a ceremonial chamber, the symbolism of this act unfolded with a gravity that pressed upon every breath. The tatami mats absorbed the tension as though the earth itself listened, for in that single gesture, the slow, deliberate drawing of the blade toward the stomach, centuries of spiritual philosophy converged. Ancient texts spoke of the belly as the place where fear was conquered, where determination crystallized, where every unspoken principle of Bushido found its resting ground. A warrior who chose to cut here did so not to escape guilt, but to show that guilt no longer controlled him, that the conscience he revealed was untainted, without duplicity, without trembling before pain or death. The steel held in his hand glimmered softly, as if aware of the sanctity it was about to enact. Witnesses in white sat motionless, their presence required not to judge him, but to testify to the purity of his final declaration. And as the samurai inhaled deeply, letting the breath settle into the hara, the same breath he had once steadied before charging into battle, he accepted the truth that seppuku demanded. Only through the unveiling of the innermost place could a warrior prove the unbroken integrity of his soul. The opening of the abdomen was the opening of fate itself, a return to the origin of spirit, where every motive was exposed before the gods. Yet beneath the solemn order of the ritual lay a tension that was almost imperceptible, a question whispered in the stillness of the room. If the belly contained the essence of courage, how many warriors had faltered in their hearts long before the blade met the flesh? And in the memory of those who had not faltered, men whose calm defied mortal understanding, lingered a story even more haunting, a story embodied in the ritual that awaited, the rite in which the hand must not tremble, and where another blade, wielded by another man, waited to complete the path of honor. When the moment of seppuku finally arrived, the room transformed into a quiet sanctuary where every detail, from the faint aroma of incense rising in thin spirals to the soft rustle of white garments as witnesses adjusted their posture, served to separate this solemn act from the ordinary flow of life. The samurai knelt upon a red cloth, the color chosen not to dramatize death, but to honor the long path that had brought him to this instant, for red symbolized sincerity, the unbroken thread of truth binding a warrior to his duty. His robe, immaculate and pale as morning frost, reflected the purity he wished to restore through this final deed. Before him, on a low tray, rested the short blade, whose silence seemed heavier than iron, as though it absorbed the weight of his unspoken thoughts. Nearby stood the kaishaku, the appointed second, a man not chosen for strength, but for steadiness, compassion, and flawless mastery of the sword. He held his long blade sheathed at his side, knowing that his role was not to kill, but to release. His presence was the final mercy granted to the one who knelt, for the kaishaku would end the agony with a single, precise stroke when the moment called for it. This required a discipline beyond mere skill, for he had to observe the shifting line between courage and collapse, between the warrior's conscious act of self-opening and the arrival of unbearable suffering. Only when that invisible line was crossed could steel descend, as quietly and swiftly as a falling leaf. The room grew still when the samurai placed his hands upon the dagger. Candlelight flickered along the blade's edge, making it shimmer like a thin slice of moon. His breath slowed, one exhale to release fear, one inhale to summon strength. Witnesses watched without blinking, for they were not there to judge, but to affirm that the deed was performed with clarity of intention, that the final harmony between spirit and duty had been achieved. In those moments, the world outside seemed to vanish. There were no cicadas, no wind, no distant hum of life, only the profound hush of a rite as old as the code of Bushido itself. And then, with a movement neither abrupt nor hesitant, the blade entered flesh. A trembling brightness crossed the room, not from the steel, but from the unspoken recognition that the samurai had confronted the deepest truth of his being. Pain flared, yet his expression remained composed, transformed by a serenity that mirrored countless warriors before him, among them the resolute Taka Zenzyaburu and the two brothers who had once taught the younger how to die without fear. It was their shadows that seemed to stand behind him now, guardians of an ancient expectation. But even as the kaishaku lifted his sword in silent readiness, a question hovered in the air like the last glow of the candle. How had this revered ritual, carved from courage and necessity, survived unchanged through the centuries? And what hidden fractures within the samurai world would one day lead it to be misused, distorted, by youth who sought glory without understanding its cost? As generations passed and the samurai order drifted from the brutal simplicity of its early centuries into a world shaped increasingly by ritual, ceremony, and the quiet ambitions of courtly life, the meaning of death began to shift in the minds of many young warriors. What had once been the final resort of a man who desired only to cleanse his name gradually transformed into a notion romanticized by those who longed for recognition. The tales of ancestors who fell with perfect composure, their spirits unbroken even in their final agony, moved these youths not to humility but to restless imitation, as though death itself were an ornament to be worn to prove their worth. And thus, within the stone walls of castles and the lacquered halls of Daimyo courts, a subtle infection spread. The belief that to die beautifully was more admirable than to live wisely. There were those who, wounded by an insult uttered too carelessly or by a perceived slight from a superior, reached for the dagger with a fervor that had little to do with sincerity and everything to do with pride. Others, weakened by disappointment in love or haunted by the fear of mediocrity, chose seppuku not because duty demanded it, but because the act had become a stage upon which they hoped to inscribe their name into the memory of their clan. The sacred blade that once served only to restore balance between a man's actions and the order of heaven now glittered dangerously in the hands of the impulsive. What had been a gesture of profound moral accountability turned little by little into something distorted, a fashion, a temptation, a descent into emotional excess disguised as courage. Elders of the warrior class watched this transformation with growing unease. They understood that a samurai's strength did not lie in the speed with which he chose death, but in the steadiness with which he bore the burdens of life. True valor was not proved by surrendering existence at the first tremor of shame, but by enduring, persevering, correcting one's faults, and continuing to serve. To rush towards self-destruction was not bravery, but escape. And escape, in the eyes of the old masters, was the purest form of cowardice, for it denied the long struggle through which real character was formed. Yet their warnings often fell upon ears already enchanted by the dramatic allure of heroic demise. It was in this era, when the line between righteousness and foolishness thinned almost to invisibility, that stories began to circulate of men whose deaths brought not honor to their families, but confusion, sorrow, and whispers of madness. The very rite intended to restore harmony now risked tearing it apart. And as these troubling accounts multiplied, another ancient custom began to rise in importance, one tied not to the destruction of the self, but to the restoration of balance through blood. It emerged from the shadows like a second blade beside the first, the solemn and fearful path of retribution known as katakiuchi, promising justice where law failed, yet demanding its own equally perilous price. In a land where the law often bent under the weight of power, distance, or political intrigue, the samurai found himself bound not only to earthly authority, but to an older, stricter principle, the demand that balance be restored whenever blood had been unjustly spilled. From this obligation arose katakiuchi, the solemn rite of revenge, a practice as ancient as the warrior class itself, carrying within it the gravity of a cosmic oath. In the deep corridors of tradition, revenge was never equated with blind rage. It was a form of moral accounting. A samurai who failed to avenge the wrongful death of his father, brother, or lord did more than dishonor his lineage. He broke the harmony between heaven and men, allowing injustice to echo unanswered through the world. To act was a burden, to refrain was an unforgivable betrayal. The logic of the avenger unfolded with chilling clarity. When he sharpened his blade, he was not preparing a crime, but correcting a tear in the fabric of order. His nights were spent in silence, studying footprints of truth, tracing whispers of the killer's path, and carrying within his chest a restrained fire, not hatred, but purpose. He believed that the soul of the fallen watched him and that every hesitation was witnessed by the unseen. Villagers who encountered such a man often spoke of the heavy stillness that followed him, as if his very presence narrowed the world to a single point where justice waited to be fulfilled. His vengeance was not an eruption of fury. It was an act performed after long reflection, guided by a rule older and sterner than his own desires. No tale embodied this fierce commitment more than the story of the 47 Rōnin, men who became masterless after their lord was condemned by a cruel twist of circumstance. Their loyalty did not dissolve with his death. Instead, it deepened, becoming a vow carved into the marrow of their existence. They concealed their intentions for months, living as beggars, craftsmen, wanderers, waiting for the single night when justice could be reclaimed. When at last their blades found the man responsible, they did not flee, but willingly surrendered themselves, understanding that their own deaths were the inevitable closing of the cycle they had begun. In their minds, the world had been set right, even if their lives would soon be extinguished. Yet beneath the admiration their story inspired lay a darker question, whispered in moments of quiet reflection. What becomes of a warrior when his entire identity is shaped not by service to life, but by devotion to death, either his own or that of another? And in that question waited the final truth, one that would reveal itself only in the concluding reflection, where the meaning of the sword, the spirit, and the samurai's final destiny would stand unveiled. As the long centuries of the samurai age unfolded, a single idea endured unchanged beneath shifting dynasties, forgotten treaties, and the quiet erosion of old customs: that a warrior's life, however disciplined or turbulent, was inseparable from the blade he carried. The katana was not merely a weapon, but a mirror polished by generations of ancestors, reflecting everything a samurai dared to be: his devotion, his restraint, his fury, his clarity of thought. In its curved, seamless line lived the paradox of his existence. To uphold peace, he must be ready for violence, and to preserve honor, he must sometimes walk willingly toward death. Thus, both seppuku and katakiuchi, though opposite in action, stood as twin expressions of the same unyielding truth, that honor outweighed breath, and duty shaped the contours of a man's destiny more profoundly than the beating of his heart. In moments of contemplation, when a samurai laid the sword before him and bowed until his forehead touched the lacquered floor, he acknowledged the fragile boundary that separated the living from the dead. The blade bore witness to his choices, and its silent presence reminded him that courage was not found in craving death nor in avoiding it, but in standing unmoved before the demands of conscience. For seppuku was not an invitation to leap into oblivion. It was a burden carried only when all paths of life had been exhausted, when a warrior could restore balance only by surrendering his body. Conversely, katakiuchi was never intended as a license for personal bloodlust. It existed to anchor the world when justice had been fractured, guiding the hand not through hatred but through solemn responsibility. The lessons of countless fallen men echoed through the dojos and temples where young warriors trained, urging them to understand that the true test of their path was not the swiftness with which they could raise a blade, but the discipline required to keep it sheathed. The greatest victories were often the ones the world never saw, the moment a man chose patience over pride, humility over anger, or endurance over despair. Death followed every samurai like a silent companion, yet he was taught not to rush toward it, for unnecessary sacrifice served no purpose and left no honor behind. The ideal lay in living long enough to serve well, and dying only when service reached its final threshold. And so, in the twilight of an era where warriors once shaped the fate of provinces and emperors, one truth remained as immovable as the mountains rising over the old roads of Yamato. The sword was the soul of a samurai, a living symbol of his purity, and death, whether chosen in ritual or delivered in righteous vengeance, was merely the final reflection of that purity upon the world.